Hi everyone, this is Martin Nutty and you're listening to the Artist Stew podcast. Welcome back to the 10th episode in our Lost in Belfast series, which has been brought to you through the kind support of Tourism Ireland. On the last day of our October visit to Belfast, I joined my guest, poet Linda McKenna, in the Observatory, the fabulous roof bar of the Grand Central Hotel. The sun was gone down as we sat down to talk about her work, her writing, and our shared history that comes from having grown up a few hundred yards away from each other. As darkness set over Linenopolis and the city below lit up, stories were told, poetry was read, and we spoke of a deeper history of people mostly forgotten by time. I hope you enjoyed the episode, which for me was a trip into the past with a friend who took a very different and interesting path than I. And so, on to the episode. We are sitting in the wonderful Grand Central Hotel in Belfast in the Observatory room. And I'm delighted to be joined by Linda McKenna. And Linda and I have a long history which stretches back longer than any guest that we've had on the podcast before, because I believe we were in school together when we were 4 years old.
We started on the same day.
We started on the same day in a small primary school in Concealy, North County, Dublin. But Linda, since then, has moved on and travelled a little bit, fetching up in Britain, and now is a long-time resident of Northern Ireland. But among her many claims to fame is a number of different collections of poetry, which I believe started off with a wonderful collection by the name of In the Museum of Misremembered Things. And recently, Linda's brought out her second published collection called 4,000 Keys. Linda also happens to be the recipient in 2018 of the Seamus Heaney Award for New Writers, and I'm delighted to feature a poet in our Sights, Sounds and Tastes of Belfast. And with all that, I would like to welcome Linda McKenna.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Lovely to see you after all these years. Lovely to have a chat.
And I was trying to remember when the last time was. It certainly must have been after your Deb's dance,
yes.
But I'm not quite sure.
I don't know. Maybe on the bus coming home from college one day or something. But certainly years. Maybe I might have met you when we were walking the castle. You were home from America, probably met walking in the castle, in Malahide Castle.
Yep.
But how long ago that was? Definitely before COVID.
You know what I'd like to do? I'd like to just start this off with a reading from your latest book. So do you have something that you would like to read for us?
Yeah, I'll read this one, which is called Cartography. And I'll read this because I've got a love-hate relationship with maps. I can't read them. I don't understand them. They make me cry. They terrify me, actually. I'm the world's worst navigator. But as things, I think they're really beautiful. I think they're absolutely beautiful things. So I have a very strong love-hate relationship with maps. So this is a poem called Cartography. I have made a map for the lost. It skirts the main thoroughfares, favours blind alleys and dead ends. In broad daylight, I copy it over and over, wearing out my stack of coloured pencils. The pairings crisp and fall around my feet. I think about steeping my map in tea to make it look old, seem more real. I might lodge it between broken window panes, under loose paving slabs, inside an abandoned dog kennel, or in the wrecked ship dying by the riverbank, anywhere the lost might be. The key is the one we learnt at school, a legend pitched between childish drawings and an arcane code. Concentric circles or slopes, gentle or steep. Dotted lines, borders, but a windmill is a windmill.
That's lovely. So you've had a long career, a working career, and as we know, poetry is not a world where, except for the very few, will turn it into a source of professional income.
Absolutely not.
So tell me about the moment when you decided that this was a form
that you wanted to engage in? Were you secretly writing all these decades, or when did this happen?
I never wrote when I was younger, and I was one of those children in school who hated the task. I'm sure you remember that, write a poem about spring, write a poem about autumn, write a poem about June. I hated doing that. I could never do it. It was not a thing that appealed to me. I had no interest in creative writing. I read, but I had no interest in creative writing at all. And then on my 50th birthday, my friends and I were in Copenhagen treating ourselves to a girls' weekend away in Copenhagen. And we were talking about, as you might imagine, things we wish we had done when we were younger. And I said to her, I wanted to do ballet. I wanted to be a ballet dancer. Now, a more ungainly, uncoordinated child you could not have met than me, but I wanted to be a ballet dancer. And she said, they have second chance ballet classes in the Crescent Arts. And I said, no, Jill, I think that ship has well and truly sailed. I'm not going to second chance ballet. And she said, I've always wanted to write a thriller. And I said, should we find a writing class and go to that? So we found a one-day introduction to creative writing in Queen's. And we tootled along on Saturday. And it was one of those classes where everybody there was a middle-aged woman, apart from a very young girl and a very young man, neither of whom came back after lunch. So all of we middle-aged and some elderly ladies sat there experimenting with writing different forms. And I was just writing like everybody else. And then suddenly a poem came to me, which sounds very dramatic, but a poem came to me. And I wrote it down. And the tutor said, you should send that out to a magazine. And I was completely gobsmacked. And I thought, well, maybe I'll do another couple of courses. So I found a couple of online courses, and then I found a couple of one-day courses, and just started to write poems and started to send poetry out. And then won the Seamus Heaney Award, which is very unexpected. And that's really how I started. So very serendipitous and not something I had been thinking about or looking for. But once I started, it was something that I really couldn't stop doing. Now, I'd have to say I'm a very slow writer, and I'm not a very disciplined writer, but it really started with that sort of simple, why don't we go to a writing class conversation.
So do we now refer to you going forward as the accidental poet?
That's right, yes. Accidental poet.
Let's do this. Let's roll the clock back to our shared childhood and tell the listeners about life in North County Dublin in the 1960s and 1970s. Earliest memories.
My earliest memory is actually going to school on a really wet day when it was so wet. And those days we all walked to school by ourselves. Our older children took us to school. But on that particular day, my mother and other mothers came with us because I think it was just so wet. And that's one of my earliest memories. My other really early memory is standing or sitting, I must be very small, in the front room. And my mother was putting up new net curtains, which were a big thing, obviously, back then. And she's putting up new net curtains, standing on a chair, putting up new net curtains on the window. And I have a really strong memory of that. And I can't have been more than about 2.5 or 3 with that memory. So they're my sort of my earliest memories. Obviously, as Martin, we live in a very rural part of North County Dublin. I mean, now it's all houses and more houses. But when I was a child, it was fields, and we were quite isolated and remote, really. We were Dubliners, but not real Dubliners. So it was a very unique
Surrounded
place.
by cabbages.
Surrounded by cabbages, yeah.
And carrots.
That's right.
And turnips.
And grain, because we lived next door to Murphy's, and they grew the grain for Guinnesses, basically. So every autumn, sort of August, September, there would have been the bales, and we would have played in the bales, wrecking the farmers' bales, I'm sure, and making forts out of the bales. And also, I left Dublin in 1987 before the Celtic Tiger. So I missed all that Celtic Tiger stuff. So
you moved to Britain. Yeah. I guess where did you do your college? Was it that side of the ocean?
No, I went to Trinity, did a degree in English and History in Trinity in Dublin, and then worked in the Irish Civil Service for a couple of years, and then went to Leicester to do a Master's in Victorian Studies.
Victorian
Studies. Yeah.
What exactly is Victorian Studies?
Well, it was a combination of Victorian novels. So there was modules on the Brontes and Hardy and things like that.
You've been stoked in literature all this time. You're saying, I didn't do any writing or anything.
But it was just
You're getting hammered by this stuff, right?
Yeah, it was all, I suppose maybe it was all marinating in there. And Victorian Studies also included a lot of history modules. So it was a very what they would now call cross-curricular, didn't use the word in those days, what they would now call a cross-curricular Masters, and then went to work in various places, worked in the University of Leicester for a while, and then went to work in a museum, a new museum they were building in northwest Leicestershire, which is a coal mining area, and then came to Northern Ireland.
So the museums rose into your life,
Yes.
and it's been museums ever since?
Yes, I recently moved. I worked in the museum in Downpatrick for 27 years, which is an old jail, and I moved a couple of years ago to a broader heritage role, but I'm still archives and objects. And a lot of my poetry is very based on archival sources and historical sources.
So tell me about Downpatrick. It's obviously famous as being the burial place of St.
That's
Patrick.
right. So
But for a listener around the world that may not be familiar with that part of the world, tell me a little bit about that. Why would you go to Downpatrick?
I went there because the job came up, and the job came up in the old 18th century jail of Down, which is where the museum is. And the 18th century jail of Down was a convict jail, so 400 prisoners from that jail end up in Australia. It's also the jail where Thomas Russell, the United Irishman, he ended his days there. He was executed at the front of the old jail. But it was a museum inside the jail, so it's not Kilmainham Jail, which is a jail museum. It's a museum inside the jail wall, so it's got a big collection of other objects. Downpatrick is, of course, famous as the alleged resting place of St. Patrick, and its links with St. Patrick in early Christian Ireland are what I suppose makes it unique and famous. It's about 22 miles south of Belfast, not very far from Strangford Lough, so it's got the sea or Strangford Lough nearby. It's an area of County Down which was known as McKenna's, so it's very similar to North County Dublin in some ways, in that it's an area of very strong Anglo-Norman influence. As the Gaelic lords regained their power in Ulster, that bit of southeast Ulster remains very strongly Anglo-Norman. So it's quite similar to North County Dublin. And you hear some of the same names. So, some of the names that we would be familiar with from that, you'll find those around McKenna and Downpatrick, unlike other parts of Northern Ireland.
So Linda and I grew up in a place called Concealy, which is hard next door to a town called Malahide, which is probably the most Protestant village/town in North County Dublin, which is interesting. And I'm reminded of certain names like McAllister, for example.
Yeah.
So
they're not so common in Downpatrick, but would be common, obviously, in County Antrim.
And we were talking earlier, of course, about another very famous member of the Irish diaspora, who was a McAllister, who was playing on the recent Argentinian team that won the World Cup.
Yes.
Who actually traces his roots from a town called Donabate, which is the town next door to Malahide from the 19th century.
Yeah, that's right.
But enough kind of odd genealogical talk. Talk to me about moving north of the border.
Yeah, I suppose I'd lived in Leicester for 6 years and then was just looking for a job. And at that point, there were very few heritage or related jobs in the Republic of Ireland. And my then husband, he got a job in Queen's, so I was looking for a job here. So initially I ended up in Fermanagh, which is very different to Downpatrick, and was there for a year as a community relations stroke cultural traditions officer, and then got the job in the museum in Downpatrick. Fermanagh feels very west of Ireland. And actually one of the really interesting things I always remember, I was talking to a man there when I was working, and he said the real difference in Ireland isn't between north and south, isn't between what he would have called the Free State and Northern Ireland, it's between the west and the east. And I think that is actually very true. The huge difference in Ireland between east and west.
Yeah, and what's interesting as an immigrant to America, it's unusual to be a Dubliner in America. It is much more common to be a person of West of Ireland origin in America, because, of course, the massive waves of migration in 19th century America all came out of the counties that were most severely impacted by the famine.
Yes.
So Mayo, Cork, Kerry, all along that Atlantic seaboard, you have these massive waves. And so as a Dubliner, that made me an odd duck in that respect.
Yeah.
So did you feel odd duckish in your arrival in north of Ireland?
Certainly in Fermanagh you do, because it feels the nearest big town after Enniskillen and Sligo. So it certainly felt like the country, really, what we would have called the country, as opposed to, and you did feel that you were somebody from the capital city in a sort of much more rural location. So certainly, yes, I did. And I suppose I still feel that too. I still have that thing that people wouldn't do that in Dublin, which we all bring with us everywhere we go. And that bit of more city slickers, even though we're not from the city at all, really, but from a very rural part of Dublin. So I suppose that's still there, I think. And I'm also conscious that when I go back to Dublin now, I go back to Malahide and Concealy. I don't go back to the city because I'm too old to be going out at night time now or doing those kind of things.
So talk to me about how all that cocktail of influences and experiences show up in your poetry. I've read you have a very strong feminist element to your poetry, but what would you point to as the driving material that pops into your head and said, okay, that's an idea that I can run with?
I'm very interested in women's voices and lost voices in the archives. So I'm currently working on a collection about 1798. I'm looking at women's voices in the archives. And I'm interested in the sort of the dispossessed and the lost in history. They do tend to be, because of the way history is written and history is preserved, they do tend to be more female than male. So that's what I'm really interested in as well. I'm also interested in the fact that women get not just sidelined in history, but their concerns are not seen as being major. Their concerns are seen as being domestic and minor and familial, as opposed to being huge or national or military or whatever. So I'm interested in that. I think as well, my grandmother, whom you will remember, of course, she was a huge influence on me in that she grew up when the state was created. And all those big changes that historians obsess about, the decadal centenaries, they just passed her by. Her life was about work, and it was about bringing up her children. I mean, she was widowed with two young children, and it was about getting by and enduring. The politics were just something that happened elsewhere, and she still had to work and go out to work. And I'm interested in that kind of different experience of history, I suppose.
As I get older, I find myself to be increasingly curious about social history as opposed to great man history, with the emphasis many times on the man and rarely on the woman. And so, I think that's a rich vein to mine, but you're not mining it from a historian point of view or somebody that's involved in the museum trade. You're mining it as a poet. So give me an idea of a poem where you came across something in an archive and said, yes, I want to run with that. And how does it manifest itself? Or do you have a reading that you could go to?
Well, I suppose my whole second collection, half of my second collection, 4,000 Keys, is inspired by the story of Elizabeth Dunham. And in 1819, Elizabeth Dunham was charged at the Old Bailey with the theft of the keys of the Bank of England. The keys were worth 5 shillings. But when she was followed back to her lodgings, and the porter of the Bank of England discovered she had about 4,000 keys, which she'd stolen from a huge range of public buildings across London. And she'd labelled them. She'd labelled them with the date she stole them and where they were from. It's a fascinating story. And she'd stolen the keys of the House of Lords, the House of Commons, the Royal College of Physicians, the Foundling Hospital, the Greenwich Watchtower, the Temple Stairs, the Guildhall, Maidstone Jail, all of these public buildings. But she'd never used those keys. She'd never broken into the buildings. She hadn't got the keys to the Bank of England and broken and stolen money. She hadn't gone to Maidstone Jail and released the prisoners or gone to the Foundling Hospital and opened up the doors. She had just taken the keys. And I was fascinated by this story of his, and she wasn't young, she was about 50 when she started this kind of crime spree. And I was fascinated with the story of this respectably dressed woman, and middle-aged women are the most invisible demographic, really. And she'd made her way throughout London stealing all these keys and storing them and labelling them and cataloguing them, but not actually seeking entrance into any of the buildings. And I just found that so fascinating in terms of her kind of travels around London, but also this fact that she obviously wanted the symbols access to institutions that she would have been in for a variety of reasons, but not actually ever breaking into them. And I found that really significant and really amazing that she would do that. And that kind of inspired me to think about some of the buildings she stole the keys from, what was going on in those buildings, but also that notion of a woman just taking to the roads and carrying out this remarkable kind of pilgrimage, really, and how that speaks to a lot of women of that age and my own age about what do you do? I was thinking about my son's grown up now, so what do you do when you're a mother but your child's gone away? You're a mother, but you're not required. You're still required, but you're not required every day. And that's a very interesting shift and change in your life.
I'm just wondering, is there a word for Elizabeth? Is she a klepto-clef?
No, of course, she was found guilty, but she was found non-compos mentis and sent to Bedlam.
Oh, God.
And where she died a couple of years later. So that's what happened to her.
How terribly sad.
Yes, it's really sad.
Was she functional?
She appears to be, there's a kind of backstory with her, and she had grown-up children. At least she did at least one grown-up child, because her son-in-law spoke for her at her trial, and he said that she had been respectably married, very important in those days, well-educated, respectably married. When her husband died, she'd invested her money in a lodging house, and then some terrible, corrupt deceiver practiced upon her and got the rest of her money off her. And then she went to law and lost the rest of her money. So she's been driven mad by this sort of terrible thing that happened to her. But she says a very sad thing, in quote, she said, "I have lots of family but no friends." It's really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So obviously, as a way of coping, she decided she was going to go around and state all these keys. But
And is her collection of keys still extant?
don't think so. The story was reported in the Times and Gentleman's magazines and Chronicles of the Year and things like that. And then she just fades from history. She just fades away.
Yeah, it's interesting. And we featured one of our guests on the podcast. Actually, he's a two-time guest, a gentleman by the name of Finn Dwyer, who is the host of the Irish History podcast. And he wrote an interesting book called Irish History as Seen. I believe it's called Irish History as Seen Through 18 Murders.
Oh, yes, I know that. Yeah.
What is revealed, what is very interesting about murder trials. Now, Finn's approach to murder was not of the lurid nature of murder, but the actual trials themselves provide a rich vein into the social history, often of quite ordinary lives.
Yes.
And so I think that this is really the opportunity to cast a spotlight on lives in the past. And again, it's been expressed obviously in your poetry and this very poignant tale of a woman, who has lost connection.
Yeah.
And it's very sad. And she's gathering the keys almost like to gain access again in some way.
Yeah.
And hence your book, of course, 4,000 Keys. Can I ask you to maybe indulge us in another reading?
Okay, let me see. I'll read this one here because one of the things I discovered was she'd stolen the keys to the Bank of England, but the Bank of England Museum have a really interesting site, and they do lots of educational work and they've got lots of videos. And in one of their videos, it tells you that an ounce of gold would stretch 50 miles. So if you stretch an ounce of gold, it would cover 50 miles. So this poem was called 50 Miles. On the fourth night of sleeplessness, I followed a fox as she scavenged through the city, drinking puddles of stars, eating crescents of lemon. I pinned myself to her as she shadowed the river, her landmarks, Stella Maris and St. Sepulchre, mangy and aging, beyond breeding and sacrifice. Nothing holds her to home but the loose thread of memory, cup scents and blood, small victories, unravelling further and further, until she has covered the stretch of an ounce of pure gold.
So is that the voice of Elizabeth as you imagined her? Yeah.
Yes, I think so. Some of these poems, especially the ones at the beginning, are in what I imagine her voice to be. And of course, I don't really know what that voice was. And then other poems, as you go further into the collection, are just general poems.
So tell me, going forward, I know there's 2 published collections of poetry. I know there's a third that isn't published.
Yeah, it's not finished yet.
Not finished
No,
yet.
very slow.
So you referenced the fact that you're an accidental poet in a way, or that's a term I apply to you, maybe unfairly.
No, I don't think so.
Talk to us about the next steps, or is there a plan, or is it just you follow what comes across your mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think I've got a very peculiar mind that works in very peculiar ways, and I hold on to very strange pieces of information. And because I'm constantly reading historical archives and things like that, what tends to inspire me the most, although there are poems in here which are sort of family-based poems, my next collection, I hope, will be based around 1798 archives. So particularly 1798 in County Down, and looking at women, trying to recover women's voices from the archives. And I do that in my work as well, and I hope to maybe write some general articles about that as well. I do facilitation, so I facilitate poetry workshops for a variety of organisations, libraries and community arts, and so I do that as well. I'm hoping to take some finish work early so I can concentrate more on writing and poetry. I've been lucky as well. I've had a couple of commissions by the Poetry Jukebox. The Poetry Jukebox is an amazing initiative which Maria McManus, another Belfast-based poet, is a real stalwart behind, and there's poetry jukeboxes all around the place in Paris and Stuttgart, and the latest one, which was in Paris, is now in the Lindenhall Library, and that's poems commissioned by poets who write about Robert McAdam's lexicon. Robert McAdam was an Irish language enthusiast from the early 19th century, and the lexicon is this incredible, not a dictionary, but incredible collection of words which he got. Irish words, which are then translated into 28 other languages, and the Lindenhall Library hold that. And we were commissioned to write a number of poems, and that's been in Paris, and now it's in Belfast. So I've been very lucky to have had a couple of commissions for poetry jute books.
Yeah, on our first day in Belfast, actually, we had the pleasure of visiting the Lindenhall Library and speaking with the director, Julie Andrews.
Yeah.
And she indeed did mention the lexicon.
Yes.
And the extraordinary collection of words.
He was a manufacturer. We had an iron foundry, but he would have learned Irish at a very young age. He was one of those Presbyterian enthusiasts for the Irish language, and was really an incredibly important scholar, an incredibly important Irish language scholar. And then starts this lexicon, which is just amazing. A is missing, so the A book is missing. So it starts with the B's. And you can see he kept it in the foundry. So it's got little stains on it from the foundry. It's a huge 9 volumes of all these words. A huge range of languages.
So 1798 is resonating with you big time.
Yes, I'm fascinated by it.
Why?
Yeah. I think it's because of the jail where I worked, the County Jail of Down Museum, that held huge amounts of 1798 prisoners. So from when it opened in 1796 through to the last 1803, an enormous amount of rebels were in that jail. They were in many cases released, sometimes executed, sometimes sent off to New Geneva Barracks in Waterford for military service abroad. So I think what's interesting about 1798, especially in County Down, is there's a huge amount of archival information. There's tons of documents, thousands and thousands of documents, not all necessarily related to each other. So it's one of the few places where you can hear ordinary people's voices. And it's also one of the few places where you can hear ordinary women's voices, because women were called as witnesses. So they're witnesses at court-martials. They make statements, they swear statements, they say what they were doing, what their menfolk were doing. And these are ordinary people, many of whom can't actually write at all. They just sign their statement with an X. So to me, it's fascinating. It's actually where you can hear really authentic local voices. And it's one of those few sources where you get that.
And the other thing, obviously, wandering around Belfast, you can't fail but to encounter 1798. And I'm just thinking towards my childhood education and my secondary school education. And certainly 1798 was on the radar. But what seemed to be poorly emphasized in 1798 was the Presbyterian nature of that revolution, or rebellion. And also, of course, Theobald Wolfe Tone is a Dubliner and of, I believe, would have been a Church of Ireland type. And my educational experience, it seemed to be quite quickly tiptoed around in the Republic, where the educational system was dominated by the Catholic Church.
Yes.
So I wonder, has that resonated with you in the same way?
So I think we learned about Wexford.
Yes.
We would have thought nothing happened, only Wexford. There was really nothing else ever went on. And I remember my grandmother singing songs about Bulla Vogue and that. So I suppose in our consciousness, there was a thing that happened in Wexford, and it was all very Catholic, and there were priests trailing people out and whatever. And that's actually, of course, not the case at all. And it begins here with Presbyterians in Belfast, and in County Down, it is the battles of Ballyhinge and St. Field, are where thousands of ordinary men from North Down, generally from North Down in the Ards, come out, and they're mostly Presbyterian. So you're talking about thousands of men, and they're ordinary. They're weavers and hoosiers and tailors. There are the great and the good are there as well, but it's those ordinary people, and what motivates them is what I think is really fascinating, because we still don't really know what motivates them to come out. From their statements, we can see what motivated them individually, but it's such a rich source of local information, and such a rich source of still things we don't know.
And of course, it's this extraordinary thing. It's again, a gap in my own knowledge and understanding, but it plays out in a very international way.
Yes.
That may not be as obvious
Yes.
to many people, because it plays out against the background of the American Revolution, against the background of the French Revolution, against the background of the Enlightenment, against the background of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. And much of it seems to me to be a combined case for optimism, and let's say this horrible hierarchy of aristocracy may no longer be valid anymore.
Yeah. But the year after the French Revolution, the next year, they're marked by huge demonstrations in Belfast and Patrick and places like that. People going out to commemorate the French Revolution, and yet Presbyterian ministers write in the paper saying this is the greatest thing that has ever happened in human history. This is the greatest thing, this overthrowing of this terrible, corrupt aristocratic regime is the greatest source of hope that we have. And so I did see a funny thing. I saw a talk advertised somewhere in Belfast, and I think the title was Presbyterians Unlikely Revolutionaries, and I thought, no, Presbyterians are the most likely revolutionaries and not unlikely at all, because Presbyterianism holds within it the thing about your individual relationship to God, your individual relationship to the Bible, your individual relationship to society, and opposing the hierarchy. So you go, no, they're not unlikely revolutionaries. They are the most likely revolutionaries, and certainly they are in the 1790s.
And I think sometimes a lot of what is misunderstood about this period in time is that actually triggered the first big wave of migration into America, which was not the famine, which many Irish people think, but was actually the Presbyterians who were
the century before
political refugees. And they fetch up in America and they become the Scotch-Irish. And so there is... Many Irish people think the first Irish president was JFK, but actually there was
a whole load of them.
10 or
I can't
15
even
of
think
them
of them.
before.
Loads of them.
All kind of Scots-Irish.
In the mid-18th century, there's a really bad weather, like a kind of mini ice age, and really poor harvests, which results in all kinds of poverty. And then there's also the penal laws bearing down on Presbyterians and excluding them from all kinds of things, and they take off to America. But proportionally, more people went then than went in the famine years. Number-wise, more people went in the famine years, but as a portion of the population, more go in the mid-18th century.
Yeah, because you get this huge explosive population growth in Ireland in the early 19th century, where the population grows at some mind-boggling rate, courtesy of the penetration of the potato. And of course, we all know that ended up horribly. But I could continue to explore this in all sorts of different ways, but I'm mindful of your time, and what I'd like to again is return to this wonderful collection of poems, 4,000 Keats. So do you have something else that you would like to read?
I think I'll read one that actually is from the second part of the collection. And during lockdown, my sister started to do a lot of genealogy and discovered that my mother's mother was from the west of Ireland. And on her line, we are actually connected into the Anglo-Normans and the Scotch. So the Scots women going to marrying men in the west of Ireland. And she discovered one of our female ancestors, who was a woman called Barbara Pentland, who lived between 1704 and 1747. And she went from Edinburgh to marry a man in the west of Ireland. And the really spooky thing about this poem is the day my sister was texting me to say, I found this woman, Barbara Pentland, Christopher, my son, was texting me to say, I'm walking in the Pentland Hills. So that is completely true and really spooky. So this is a lineage. With the perseverance of a needlewoman, as if she had a mirror behind a tapestry frame, my sister has reached kirtles and wimples. Travel-stained, lugging boxes of seeds, bone hoops and prayer books, they fall into a straggling, shimmering line. In their seams, sea salt and river mud. In Barbara's veil, the dust of tottering Edinburgh. On her hem, its intractable blood. She emerges on the day my son is walking in the Pentland Hills, swimming in a freezing loch. The coincidence, stunning our Sunday. This discontinuous weft of history, its cracked marble breeding lichen and monsters, but also gifting Malthus and Janet, Margaret and Isabel, who, where other women snipped close the threads at the back of their embroideries of fading, brittle silk, not of them instead, kept a pot of honey wrapped safe in straw, mourned roses and raspberries, poured over mildewed copies of A Cure for Ague, A Cure for Want.
And I wonder at the extraordinary story behind that ancestor of yours. I think a lot of times our educational system tells us that people never traveled far in Ireland. And this extraordinary journey from Scotland to the west of Ireland must have been mind-boggling.
Absolutely. But just on that line, the McKenna's didn't go very far. Dun and Bate was the furthest they went. So they didn't go very far at all.
I'd like to thank you for those readings, and on behalf of myself and our listeners, and the absolute pleasure of exploring both literature in its poetic form and history, which is obviously a passion we both share. There are many stories to be told, and I'm looking forward to hearing the next ones expressed poetically. So,
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me.
A big thank you to Linda McKenna for giving us a deeper understanding of the origins and the motivations behind her writing and the words she crafts. On a personal note, I was delighted to reconnect with Linda, whose journey began in the same small corner of the world as mine, yet led to such a different and inspiring place. Do yourself a favor and grab a copy of 4,000 Keys, published by Dura Press. Trust me, it's time well invested. As always, we thank Tourism Ireland for their support of our efforts in telling contemporary stories of Belfast and Northern Ireland today. And remember to find all that's best in Irish travel throughout the island of Ireland. Visit this easy-to-remember website, ireland.com. We'll be back next week with the final episode in our Lost in Belfast series, featuring conversations with Martin Nutty, Conla McCann, along with other voices from the Belfast International Homecoming. So until next time, you've been listening to the Irish Stew podcast. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.